I helped my grandfather build a food cart into a $2 million restaurant. When he passed, they gave the keys to my brother, who never worked a single shift. I didn't argue. I just took off my apron and left. A month later, my brother called begging. My name's Austin. I'm 29 years old. And if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here telling this story, I probably would have laughed and gone back to prepping 100 pounds of brisket. That was my life. That was my whole world, actually. A kitchen, a grill, and the smell of hickory smoke so deep in my clothes that my barber once asked me if I lived inside a smoker. The answer was basically yes. Let me back up. My grandfather, Harlan, was the kind of man they don't make anymore. He came to this country from Mexico when he was 19 with about $40, a recipe for birria that could make a grown man weep, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds empires or gets you arrested. In his case, it built a food cart. A little steel box on wheels that he parked outside a factory in South Houston starting in 1983. He called it Fuego, which means fire, and that was exactly what his food was. The guy could take a $5 cut of meat and turn it into something that tasted like it belonged on a white tablecloth with a sommelier standing over your shoulder. I grew up in that cart. Not figuratively. I literally spent my childhood sitting on an overturned bucket in a 4x8 steel box, watching my grandfather turn corn tortillas on a flat top while sweat dripped off his nose. My parents, God bless them, were good people, but they worked constantly. My dad drove trucks. My mom cleaned office buildings. They dropped me off with Grandpa Harlan at 5 in the morning and picked me up at 3 in the afternoon, and in between, I learned everything. How to sharpen a knife. How to tell when oil is ready by the sound it makes. How to talk to a customer so they come back tomorrow. By the time I was 12, I could run that cart by myself. By 15, Harlan told me I was better than he was, which was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that made you stand up straighter. Here's the thing about my brother, Colton. He's 2 years older than me, and growing up he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the cart, the kitchen, or anything that involved actual effort. Colton was what my grandfather would politely call a dreamer and what my grandmother, rest her soul, would less politely call lazy. He was the golden child, though. My mom adored him. He had this easy charm, this way of walking into a room and making everyone feel like they were about to have a good time. I was the quiet one, the one with calloused hands and grease burns and a permanent squint from standing over a grill since before I could drive. I didn't resent Colton for that. Not really. People are who they are. He went off to college, changed his major 4 times, dropped out, moved to Austin the city, not Austin the brother, tried to be a DJ, tried to be a real estate agent, tried to start a clothing brand that lasted exactly 2 months, and then moved back home when he was 25 because, and I quote, he needed to find himself. Apparently finding yourself costs about $800 a month in your parents' spare bedroom. Meanwhile, I was working. Every single day. When I was 20, Grandpa Harlan sat me down in the cart after a 14-hour shift and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Austin, this cart has been good to me, but I want walls. I want tables. I want a sign that lights up at night, and I want you to help me build it." I didn't even hesitate. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The next 3 years were the hardest of my life, and I wouldn't trade a single day. We scraped together every penny. I worked the cart during the day and bartended at night. Harlan cashed in his retirement, which wasn't much, but it was everything he had. We found a space, a beat-up old building in a strip mall that used to be a nail salon. The floors were wrecked, the plumbing was a nightmare, and the first time we turned on the hood vent, a family of possums fell out of the ductwork. I'm not kidding. For possums. Harlan looked at me and said, "At least they have good taste. They picked the kitchen." We built that restaurant with our own hands. I'm talking weekends with sledgehammers, nights on our knees laying tile, arguments about paint colors that got so heated my grandmother had to mediate via speakerphone from her living room. We opened Fuego, the restaurant, on a Tuesday in March, and I remember standing outside looking at the sign, this beautiful hand-painted sign that Harlan's friend Tully had done for us, and I cried. I'm not ashamed to say it. I ugly cried in a strip mall parking lot at 7 in the morning. The first year was brutal. We barely broke even. I was working 80-hour weeks, sleeping on a cot in the back office, eating mistakes for dinner. But Harlan kept saying the same thing. The food doesn't lie, me, Joe. If the food is honest, the people will come. And he was right. Slowly, then all at once, people came. A local food blogger wrote about us. Then a newspaper. Then a TV station did a segment. Within 2 years, Fuego had a 45-minute wait on weekends, and we were pulling in revenue I never thought possible. We expanded, added a patio, hired real staff. By year 5, Fuego was doing just over $2 million a year in revenue. $2 million. From a food cart. From a man who came here with $40 and a burrito recipe. I was the head chef. I was the operations manager. I was the guy who fixed the fryer at midnight and the guy who negotiated with suppliers at 6 in the morning. Harlan was the heart, but I was the engine. Everyone knew it. The staff knew it. The regulars knew it. Harlan knew it. Colton, during all of this, would show up maybe twice a year for a free meal. He'd sit at the bar, eat a plate of carnitas, tell everyone he was Harlan's grandson like that was an accomplishment, and then disappear for another 6 months. He never washed a dish, never prepped a single onion, never showed up at 4 in the morning when the walk-in cooler died, and we had to transfer $2,000 of meat to a rental truck in the rain. That was me. That was always me. Then, 8 months ago, Grandpa Harlan got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel, the way that particular monster always is. He went from the strongest man I knew to a hospital bed in 11 weeks. I ran the restaurant during the day and sat with him at night. I held his hand when he couldn't talk anymore. I told him about the specials and the new hot sauce recipe I was working on because I didn't know what else to say, and because I think he could still hear me. He passed on a Wednesday. I closed the restaurant for a week, and then I went to the reading of the will. Now, I need to tell you something about my family before I get to the will, because it matters. My parents loved both of us, but they had a blind spot for Colton that was roughly the size of Texas. Every time Colton failed at something, it was because the world didn't appreciate him. Every time I succeeded, it was expected. Austin's the reliable one. Austin will figure it out. Austin doesn't need encouragement because Austin just does things. You know what that does to a kid over 20-something years? It makes you really good at doing things and really bad at asking for anything in return. My mom, Jolene, she's not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. But she had this thing where she'd talk about Colton's potential like it was currency. Colton has so much potential. Colton just needs the right opportunity. Meanwhile, I had an actual restaurant doing $2 million a year, and she'd say, "That's nice. Honey, have you talked to your brother lately? He's been down." I figured the will would be straightforward. Harlan and I had talked about it. Not in specific legal terms, but in the way you talk about the future when you're elbow deep in a prep list at midnight. He told me Fuego was ours. He said I'd earned it. He looked me in the eye and said, "This place is yours. Mijo, don't ever let anyone take it from you." So imagine my face when the lawyer read the will and Harlan had left the restaurant. The entire business, split evenly between me and Colton. 50-50. Equal partners. The guy who built it with his bare hands, and the guy who couldn't find the kitchen with a map and a flashlight. But that's not even the part that broke me. That came 3 days later. 3 days after the will reading, my mom called a family meeting at my parents' house. I walked in expecting grief, maybe some tears, maybe a conversation about how we were all going to honor Harlan's memory. What I got was an ambush. Colton was sitting at the kitchen table with this look on his face that I can only describe as rehearsed sincerity. My mom was next to him, and my dad was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, which is his universal signal for "I don't want to be here, but your mother made me." My Aunt Rosalind was there too, which should have been my first red flag because Rosalind only shows up when there's drama or free food, and I didn't see any casseroles. My mom started talking before I even sat down. She said, "Austin, we've been thinking about Grandpa's will, and we think the fairest thing would be for Colton to take over managing the restaurant." I actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A full, disbelieving laugh. The kind that comes out of your body before your brain can stop it. I said, "I'm sorry, what?" My mom kept going like I hadn't spoken. She said Colton needed this opportunity, that he'd been struggling, and this could be the thing that finally gave him direction. She said Harlan would have wanted the family to come together, and that Colton deserved a chance to prove himself. She actually used the word deserve. I want you to sit with that for a second. The man who never chopped a single onion deserved to run a $2 million restaurant. I looked at Colton and said, "Do you even know what our food cost percentage is?" He stared at me like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics in Mandarin. He said, "I can learn. I'm a fast learner." A fast learner. This is a man who took 6 months to learn how to use a French press. I watched him struggle with a French press. People. It has one moving part. You push it down. I tried to be calm. I really did. I said, look, I've been running this restaurant for years. I know every vendor, every recipe, every employee's schedule. Harlan and I built this from nothing. You can't just hand the keys to someone who's never even worked a shift. It doesn't work like that. That's when Rosalind jumped in, because of course she did. She said, Austin, you're being selfish. Your grandfather left this to both of you equally. Colton has just as much right to be involved as you do. Involved. There's a difference between being involved and being in charge. I'd have been fine with Colton being involved. Come in, learn the business, work the line, understand what it takes. But that's not what they were proposing. They wanted him to be the face, the decision maker, the one with the title. And they wanted me to keep doing what I'd always done, which was all the actual work. I turned to my dad. He was the one person I thought might back me up. Wes is a practical man. He understands hard work. He looked at me, and I could see it in his eyes that he knew this was wrong. But then my mom put her hand on his arm, and he looked at the floor and said, maybe just give your brother a chance, Austin. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not broke, cracked. Like a windshield that takes one more pebble, and suddenly you can see the fracture lines spreading in every direction. I said, fine, I'll think about it. And I left. Over the next week, I tried to keep things normal at the restaurant. But Colton started showing up. Not to work. To observe, he said. He'd wander around the kitchen with his hands in his pockets asking questions like, so how long does it take to cook a steak? He once asked my sous chef Emmett why we didn't just buy pre-made tortillas to save time. Emmett looked at me like he was watching a nature documentary about an animal that shouldn't have survived natural selection. Colton also started making suggestions. He thought we should add a DJ on weekends. He wanted to rebrand the menu with what he called a modern aesthetic, which apparently meant putting everything in lowercase and adding the word artisan in front of items that had been on our menu for 20 years. He suggested we start a TikTok account where he'd film himself tasting dishes, which I'm sure would have been riveting content considering the man's most sophisticated food opinion was that ketchup was a versatile condiment. But the real breaking point came on a Thursday night. We were slammed. Full dining room, 40-minute wait, the kitchen running like a machine because that's what I'd built it to be. I was on the line expediting, calling orders, keeping the whole thing moving. And Colton walked in with 3 of his friends, skipped the wait, sat themselves at a table that was reserved for a regular, and told the server to put it on the house tab. I found out when Waverly, our front-of-house manager, came to me looking like she was about to have an aneurysm. She said, your brother just comped a $200 table and told the staff he's the new owner. I put down my tongs. I wiped my hands on my apron. I walked out to the dining room, and I stood in front of Colton's table while his friends were mid-bite on $50 plates of food that I had cooked, with recipes that my grandfather taught me, in a restaurant that I had bled for. I said, Colton, can I talk to you outside? He smiled and said, can it wait, bro? We're in the middle of dinner. I said, no, it can't wait. We stepped outside and I told him, very calmly, that he couldn't comp tables, he couldn't skip the wait, and he couldn't tell staff he was the new owner because he wasn't. He was a co-owner on paper who had never worked a single shift. Colton's whole demeanor changed. The easygoing charm dropped, and underneath it was something I'd seen before but never directed at me. Resentment. He said, the will says 50-50, Austin. That means I have just as much say as you do. And honestly, I think this place could use some fresh energy. You've been running it the same way Grandpa did, and that's great. But maybe it's time for something new. Something new. He wanted something new. I spent 9 years of my life building something extraordinary, and he wanted to waltz in and add a DJ booth. I went back inside. I finished the shift. I closed the restaurant at midnight, cleaned the kitchen myself because that's what I always did, and sat in Harlan's old office chair, the one with the duct tape on the armrest because he never wanted to replace it. I sat there and I thought about what my grandfather told me. This place is yours, Mijo. Don't ever let anyone take it from you. The next morning, my mom called. She said Colton told her I was being hostile and territorial. She said I needed to be more welcoming. She said, and this is a direct quote, he's your brother, Austin, family comes first. Family comes first. Where was that energy when I was 16 and missing my own birthday party because the cart had a catering order? Where was that energy when I was 23 and sleeping on a cot in the back office because we couldn't afford to close for renovations? Where was family comes first when Colton was in Austin, the city, playing DJ, while I was in Houston building a legacy. I called the restaurant's lawyer, a sharp woman named Sloan who'd handled our contracts for years. I asked her one question. If I walk away, what happens? She said, legally, you can resign from operations at any time. You're a co-owner, not a slave. Your ownership stake remains. But without you, the day-to-day operation of that restaurant would need to be managed by your co-owner or a hired replacement. I thanked her and hung up. And then I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I walked into Fuego the next morning, took off my apron, folded it neatly on the prep station, and told Emmett he was in charge until further notice. He looked at me like I'd just told him the building was on fire. I said, "I'm sorry, brother. I have to go." I didn't say goodbye to anyone else. I didn't make an announcement. I just left. The silence in my car was deafening. The first week after I left Fuego was the worst week of my life, and I'm including the week my grandfather died. At least when Harlan passed, I had purpose. I had the restaurant. I had something to pour myself into. Now I had nothing but a lease on a one-bedroom apartment, a savings account that was respectable but not exactly retire at 29 money, and a phone that kept buzzing with messages I refused to read. My mom called 14 times the first day. I know because I counted. Colton called twice, which was honestly more effort than he'd put into anything in years. My dad sent one text that said, "Call your mother." Classic Wes. Man of few words, none of them helpful. I didn't call anyone. I sat on my couch, ate cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row, and stared at the ceiling like it owed me an explanation. I'm not going to pretend I handled it with grace. I was a wreck. I'd spent my entire adult life inside that kitchen, and now the silence was so loud it felt like my ears were ringing. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning out of habit, stand in my kitchen, and realize I had nowhere to go. Around day 4, my friend Deacon showed up at my door with a 6-pack and a bag of tacos from a place that wasn't Fuego, which I appreciated because the last thing I needed was to eat my own feelings in tortilla form. Deacon is the kind of friend everyone needs, but nobody deserves. He's an electrician, built like a refrigerator, and has the emotional intelligence of a therapist trapped in the body of a guy who watches too much football. He sat on my couch, handed me a beer, and said, "All right, tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the will, the family meeting, Colton's DJ night proposal, the comp table, all of it. Deacon listened without interrupting, which is rare for him, and when I was done he said, "So what's the plan?" I said I didn't have one. He said, "That's the first problem." He was right. I'd been so consumed by the hurt that I hadn't thought about what came next. My whole identity was tied to that restaurant. I was the head chef of Fuego. I was Harlan's grandson who built the dream. Take that away, and who was I? Some guy who was really good at dicing onions and had permanent calluses on his knife hand? But here's what Deacon said that actually changed things. He said, "Austin, you didn't build that restaurant because of the building. You built it because of what's in your head and your hands. That doesn't go away because your brother's an idiot." Something about that clicked. Not immediately. It wasn't a movie moment where inspiring music plays and I leap off the couch with a montage-ready expression. It was more like a slow defrost. Over the next few days, I started thinking. Not about Fuego. About me. I started small. I cooked. Not for a restaurant, just for myself. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, something I'd never done because Saturday mornings were always spent at Fuego prepping for the weekend rush. I bought ingredients I never had time to experiment with. Stuff I'd always wanted to try but couldn't because Fuego's menu was set and our customers expected consistency. I made a Korean-Mexican fusion taco that was so good I actually said wow out loud in my own kitchen like a lunatic. I made a smoked lamb barbacoa that would have made Harlan cry. I started posting what I cooked on social media. Nothing fancy, just pictures on my phone with captions like "Tuesday night experiment, smoked pork belly with mango habanero glaze." And people responded. Not just friends, strangers, former Fuego customers who recognized my name, food bloggers. Within 2 weeks, I had 3,000 followers and a DM from a woman named Bethany who ran a commercial kitchen rental space asking if I'd ever considered doing pop-up dinners. I hadn't, but suddenly I was. I threw my first pop-up dinner 3 weeks after leaving Fuego. 20 seats, $50 a plate. 7-course tasting menu that showcased everything I'd been experimenting with plus a few of Harlan's classics reimagined. I promoted it on social media, and it sold out in 4 hours. For hours. I almost dropped my phone when the last ticket sold. The dinner itself was electric. I cooked in a rented kitchen with borrowed plates and a playlist that Deacon curated, which meant it was 70% 90s hip-hop and 30% questionable country, but somehow it worked. The food was the best I'd ever made. And the people, oh man, the people loved it. There's a difference between cooking for a restaurant full of strangers and cooking for 20 people who are there specifically because they want to eat what you made. The energy is different. It's intimate. It's personal. A woman at table 3 cried when she tasted my burrito, and she told me it reminded her of her grandmother's cooking. I had to go stand in the walk-in for a minute after that because I am not crying in front of customers. That's a rule. Meanwhile, I was hearing things about Fuego through the grapevine. Emmett, my former sous chef, was texting me updates that read like dispatches from a war zone. Colton had fired 2 servers in the first week for reasons no one could explain. He'd changed the menu without consulting anyone, adding items that the kitchen wasn't equipped to handle. He'd tried to renegotiate the meat supplier contract and somehow ended up paying 12% more than what I'd negotiated. He'd also, and this is the part that physically hurt me to hear, he'd taken Harlan's hand-painted sign down and replaced it with a neon one that said Fuego Eats. Fuego Eats, like it was a food delivery app and not a restaurant that a man built with his bare hands. Yelp reviews started coming in. 1 star. This place used to be amazing. What happened? 2 stars. Waited an hour. Food was cold. Couldn't find a manager. 1 star. The brisket tasted like it was cooked by someone who had never seen a brisket before. I hate to say it, but I wasn't surprised. Colton didn't know the first thing about running a kitchen, and charm only gets you so far when the food is bad and the service is worse. My second pop-up sold out in 90 minutes. I raised the price to $75 a plate and added 10 more seats. I was getting calls from food journalists. A guy named Sullivan, who ran a hospitality investment group, came to my third pop-up and handed me his card afterward. He said, "Whatever you're doing next, I want to be part of it." I wasn't ready to think about next yet. I was still processing, still grieving, honestly. Not just Harlan, but the loss of the thing we'd built together. Even though I was creating something new and exciting, there was this ache underneath it all that never fully went away. I'd be in the middle of plating a dish, and I'd reach for a spice and think, Harlan would have added more cumin. And then I'd have to blink a few times and keep going. But here's what I realized during those weeks. I wasn't the restaurant. The restaurant was an expression of me, but it wasn't all of me. There was more. There was always more. Harlan knew that. He didn't just teach me recipes. He taught me how to adapt, how to be stubborn about quality but flexible about everything else, how to take a setback and turn it into a setup. By the end of the second month, I had a waiting list for my pop-ups that was over 200 people long. I'd been featured in the Houston Chronicle and a regional food magazine. Sullivan from the investment group had taken me to lunch twice and pitched me on opening my own place. And for the first time since I'd walked out of Fuego, I felt like I could breathe. That's when Colton called. I let Colton's call go to voicemail. Not because I was being petty, although I'll admit there was a small, deeply human part of me that enjoyed watching the screen light up and choosing not to answer. I let it go because I wasn't ready. I needed to be strategic, not emotional. Harlan taught me that. You don't open the oven every 5 minutes to check the brisket. You trust the process and you wait until the timing is right. The voicemail was exactly what you'd expect. "Hey Austin, it's me. Listen, things are kind of crazy over here and I was hoping we could talk. No big deal, just some stuff I need your help with. Call me back when you get a chance. Alright, cool, later." No big deal. The man was watching a $2 million restaurant burn to the ground, and it was no big deal. That's Colton in a nutshell. The house could literally be on fire, and he'd describe it as a little warm in here. I didn't call him back. Instead, I called Sloan, our lawyer. I told her everything that had been happening. She'd already heard some of it through the grapevine because Sloan was connected to everyone in the Houston restaurant scene. She told me that from a legal standpoint, my 50% ownership still entitled me to half the business's value, but that if Colton was actively running it into the ground, that value was dropping by the day. She said, "Austin, you need to decide what you want. Do you want to go back and save it? Do you want to sell your share? Or do you want to wait him out and buy it all when it's worth nothing?" I told her I needed to think. And I did think. I thought about it constantly. I thought about it while I was developing new recipes. I thought about it while I was scouting locations with Sullivan. I thought about it while Deacon and I sat on my balcony drinking beers and watching the sun set over a city that suddenly felt full of possibility. Here's what I landed on. I didn't want to save Fuego in its current form. That version of Fuego was dying, and honestly, it had started dying the moment Harlan got sick. What I wanted was to honor what Harlan built, while also building something that was mine. And the way to do both was becoming clearer every day. Sullivan and I had been talking seriously. He ran a hospitality investment group called Cornerstone, and they'd funded 3 successful restaurants in Texas over the past 5 years. He'd been to 4 of my pop-ups at this point, and he was not subtle about his interest. Over lunch at a quiet spot in Montrose, he laid it out. He said, "Austin, I'll put up the capital for a full restaurant. Your concept, your menu, your name. We'll structure it so you maintain creative control and majority operational authority. I want to invest in you, not just a restaurant." The number he threw out made me choke on my iced tea. He was talking about a 7-figure investment. A proper build-out, prime location, the works. This wasn't a pop-up in a rented kitchen anymore. This was the real thing. But I had a complication, and that complication was still legally attached to me through a will and a 50% ownership stake in a sinking ship. I told Sullivan about the Fuego situation. He didn't blink. He said, "Handle it. I'll wait. But don't wait too long because opportunities like this have expiration dates." So I made a plan. Step 1 was understanding exactly how bad things were at Fuego. Emmett had been keeping me updated, but I needed hard numbers. I called Waverly, the front-of-house manager, who was still there out of loyalty to Harlan's memory, but was, in her words, one more DJ night away from walking out. She gave me the rundown. Revenue was down 38% in 2 months. 3 key staff members had quit. The health inspection score had dropped from a 96 to an 81 because Colton had let maintenance slide. The meat supplier was threatening to switch them to cash-on delivery because Colton had missed 2 payments. 38% in 2 months. It had taken Harlan and me years to build that revenue, and Colton had torched more than a third of it in 8 weeks. I felt sick, but I also felt something else. Clarity. Step 2 was getting my legal ducks in a row. I met with Sloan and laid out what I wanted. I wanted to buy Colton's 50% of Fuego at a fair market value that reflected its current state, not its peak state. Sloan raised an eyebrow and smiled. She said, "You mean you want to buy it at a discount because your brother cratered the business?" I said, "I want to buy it at a price that reflects reality." She said, "Same thing, and I like it." She drew up a proposal. Based on the declining revenue, the lost staff, the damaged reputation, and the deferred maintenance, Fuego's current valuation was significantly lower than it had been when Harlan was alive. Sloan estimated that Colton's 50% share was worth roughly a third of what it would have been 6 months earlier. She prepared a buyout offer that was fair but firm. Step 3 was the part that required patience, which is not my strongest quality. I needed Colton to come to me. I needed him to be the one asking for help, not the other way around. Because if I went to him first, my family would spin it as Austin being aggressive, Austin being territorial, Austin trying to push his brother out. But if Colton came to me, that changed the whole dynamic. So I waited, and I didn't have to wait long. Colton called again 4 days later. This time I answered. His voice was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something tight and strained. He said, "Austin, I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" I said, "Sure. Name the place." He wanted to meet at Fuego, which I thought was either bold or clueless. Probably both. I said no. I suggested a coffee shop, neutral ground. He agreed. I spent the night before our meeting going over everything with Sloan and Deacon. Sloan prepped me on the legal side. The buyout offer, the terms, the timeline. Deacon prepped me on the emotional side. He said, "Don't let him guilt you. Don't let him make it about family. This is business. You built that place, and you know what it's worth and what it takes to run it. Don't forget that." I also called Bethany, who'd become a friend and unofficial advisor since she'd helped me set up my pop-ups. She had 20 years in the restaurant industry and a BS detector that could pick up a false promise from 3 zip codes away. She said, "Austin, the only thing you need to remember tomorrow is that you have leverage and he has nothing. You don't need Fuego, but Fuego needs you." That's the entire conversation. The morning of the meeting, I put on a clean shirt, made myself a good breakfast, and drove to the coffee shop. I got there 15 minutes early because Harlan always said if you're on time, you're late. I ordered a black coffee, sat in a corner booth, and waited. Colton walked in 12 minutes late, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His clothes were wrinkled. There was what appeared to be a hot sauce stain on his collar. He sat down across from me, and for the first time in maybe ever, my older brother looked at me without a trace of that easy confidence. He looked scared. He said, "Austin, I need your help." And I said, "I know you do. So let's talk about how this is going to work." Colton started talking before the waitress even brought him water. It poured out of him like a dam breaking. The restaurant was hemorrhaging money. Staff were quitting left and right. The meat supplier had put them on cash-only terms. 2 Yelp reviewers had called the health department. He'd tried to hire a new head chef, but nobody qualified wanted the job because word had gotten around the Houston food scene that Fuego was a sinking ship. He said he'd barely slept in 3 weeks, and he'd lost 9 pounds, which for Colton was saying something because the man treats meals like a competitive sport. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod sympathetically. I just sipped my coffee and listened, the way Harlan used to listen when a supplier was trying to lowball him. Quiet, patient, letting the other person fill the silence with everything you need to know. When Colton finally ran out of steam, he looked at me and said, "I didn't know it was this hard." I don't know. I thought it kind of ran itself. I'm going to give you a moment to appreciate that sentence. He thought a $2 million restaurant ran itself. Like it was a Roomba. Like you just flip a switch and food appears and money flows in. This is what happens when you spend your whole life watching someone else do the work and assuming the work isn't that complicated. I said, "Colton, it doesn't run itself. It ran because I ran it. 80 hours a week, every week, for 9 years." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So will you come back?" And here's where the conversation pivoted. I said, "No, I'm not coming back." His face crumpled. Like, genuinely crumpled. The way a paper bag does when you ball it up. He said, "Austin, please. I'm drowning. Mom says you're being stubborn, but I'm telling you, I can't do this. I'm not you." I said, "You're right. You're not me. And that's why I'm not coming back to work under a system where I do everything and you get equal credit. That's done. What I am willing to do is buy your share of the business." I slid Sloane's proposal across the table. He picked it up, and I watched his eyes scan the numbers. The offer was fair. More than fair, actually, given how badly he'd damaged the business. It was based on Fuego's current valuation, not its peak, which meant Colton's 50% was worth considerably less than it would have been when Harlan was alive. But it was still a significant amount of money, more than Colton had ever had in his life. He said, "This is less than half of what the restaurant was worth before." I said, "That's because the restaurant is worth less than half of what it was before. You did that, not me. I'm offering you a fair price for what exists today, not what existed 6 months ago." He got quiet again. I could see him doing the math, which was probably a new experience for him. Then he said, "Mom's going to lose it." I said, "Mom can feel however she wants about it. This is between you and me. This is business." We sat there for a while. Colton stared at the proposal. I stared at my coffee. A busboy dropped a tray of glasses somewhere behind us, and neither of us flinched, which tells you how deep in thought we both were. Finally, Colton looked up and said, "If I sign this, what happens to me?" I hadn't expected that question, and it caught me off guard. Not the words, but the vulnerability behind them. For the first time in maybe my entire life, Colton wasn't performing. He wasn't charming his way through a conversation or deflecting with humor. He was sitting across from me, terrified, admitting that he didn't know what he was going to do with himself. I said, "Colton, you take the money and you figure it out. The same way I've been figuring it out my whole life, except you'll have a head start because you'll have cash and 0 obligations." He signed the papers 3 days later. Sloane handled the transfer. It was clean, legal, and final. I became the sole owner of Fuego. Now here's the part where you might expect me to waltz back in, rehang Harlan's original sign, and restore everything to the way it was. That's not what happened. I walked into Fuego the day after the papers were finalized. I stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd spent 9 years of my life, and I felt something I didn't expect. Peace. Not excitement, not triumph. Peace. Because I knew what I was going to do next, and it wasn't what anyone saw coming. I called a staff meeting. Emmett, Waverly, the remaining crew who'd stuck it out through Colton's reign of chaos. I told them the truth. I said, "I'm going to sell the building and the Fuego name. But I'm opening a new restaurant, my restaurant, and every single one of you has a job there if you want it." Emmett said, "What are you going to call it?" I said, "Harlan's." The room went quiet, and then Waverly started crying, And then Emmett started pretending he wasn't crying, which was unconvincing because the man is 6'3" and his eyes were the color of ripe tomatoes. I told them about Sullivan and Cornerstone, about the investment, about the location I'd already scouted, a beautiful standalone building near the heights with a patio that Harlan would have loved. I told them the menu would honor everything Harlan taught me while pushing into new territory. The best of the old and the start of something new. The sale of Fuego's building and brand went through in 6 weeks. The buyer was a restaurant group that wanted the location, and they paid a price that, combined with Sullivan's investment, gave me everything I needed. Harlan's opened 4 months later. I designed the menu myself. I kept the birria, because you don't mess with perfection, and I added the Korean-Mexican fusion tacos and the smoked lamb barbacoa, and about 30 other dishes that represented everything I'd learned and everything I wanted to become. Tully, the same artist who'd painted the original Fuego sign, painted our new sign. It's beautiful. Harlan would have loved it. Opening night, we had a line around the block. Bethany was there. Deacon was there, in a sport coat, which I'm pretty sure was a first. Sullivan stood in the corner grinning like a proud uncle. Emmett ran the kitchen like a maestro. Waverly ran the floor like she was born for it, which she was. My dad showed up. He walked in, looked around, looked at the sign, and looked at me. He didn't say much because he never does. But he hugged me, and he held on a little longer than usual, and he said, "Your grandfather would be proud." That was enough. My mom came too, about a week later. We had a conversation that was long overdue. It wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't dramatic. It was two people sitting at a table being honest with each other for maybe the first time. She admitted she'd always favored Colton because she worried about him more. She said she took me for granted because I was always capable. I told her that being taken for granted was the loneliest kind of compliment in the world. She cried. I almost cried. We're working on it. It's not perfect, but it's real, and real is better than perfect. Colton. Well, Colton took the money from the buyout and actually did something surprising. He enrolled in a hospitality management program at the community college. He called me a few weeks ago and said he wanted to understand what I'd been doing all those years. He said he was sorry, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet way that means someone actually thought about what they did. I told him I appreciated that. I told him when he finishes the program, if he ever wants to learn the business for real, my door is open. Not as a co-owner, not as a boss, as family. Harlan's just passed its 6-month mark. We're booked 3 weeks out. Revenue is tracking to beat Fuego's best year, and we haven't even hit our stride yet. I still wake up at 4 in the morning, but now it's because I want to, not because I have to. I walk into my kitchen, I tie on my apron, and I cook. It's what I've always done. It's who I've always been. There's a photo on the wall by the host stand. It's me and Harlan, standing in front of the original food cart in 1999. I'm about 3 years old, sitting on that overturned bucket, and he's got a spatula in one hand and the biggest smile you've ever seen. Every time I walk past it, I say the same thing under my breath. We did it, old man. We did it.